Fantastic. How nice to be back with you, Duncan.
Yeah, same to you.
We recorded a couple of sessions already, which hopefully you've had a chance to watch on YouTube. I'm Tom Thompson. This is a good friend of mine, Duncan Forsyth. And we were talking about Revelation and COVID-19. And we thought, didn't we, it'd be good to try and come back to it a couple of weeks later and look at some of the questions that would have come out in the live seminar, and also now, a couple of weeks on, just the world. I don't know when you're watching this, but at this present moment for us, we are in the middle of a massive global debate around racism. A gentleman called George Floyd, a black man, was killed by police in custody just a few weeks ago in a way that was really upsetting, brutal really, and was captured on film. And it sparked huge conversation, which has been done in the vast majority of cases in a really productive and kind of vocal manner. And so we sit now kind of with this new reality of, oh, okay, so racial injustice is actually a greater problem in our world than maybe I'd realized. And so it would be good to think about that as well.
Indeed.
Yeah. So do we need a little recap, Duncan, on what we said?
Yeah, I guess very briefly we were talking about whether, the ongoing pandemic as it was then, and now the ongoing pandemic and kind of societal change that's obviously happening were perhaps a sign of the end of the world. And I guess we were concluding that, yes, they were, in the sense that it's important to realise that the time we're in now is the end times, but that end times does not mean like the last few years before the apocalypse, but that the end times is a period in history from Pentecost until the actual end of the age, where God's kingdom is being outworked in the world, where the fullness of God's kingdom is coming in, but has not yet reached its full fulfillment. And we're part of that end times. And so George Floyd and COVID are signs of the coming end, but that doesn't mean that you need to start panicking and stocking up on vitamin pills and to have bottled water for your basement or anything like that. It's more of a kind of spiritual thing, although we are obviously one day moving towards a fulfillment of the, a very literal end of the world as well. So, and we were talking a bit about how to live well with that knowledge. Sorry.
That's right. So these clashing kingdoms coming in of kind of the work of the enemy still, and yet God's kingdom coming in, and we live in the reality of that. So that's what we were trying to talk about, and understanding how to read the book and to get the most out of it. So the questions that I think we're going to discuss, I think we've got 3 questions really. The first one, Duncan, is so is COVID-19 from God? Is it like a punishment sent by God? Is it something that's from God? How should we understand it? That's question 1, I think. Then the question about race and racial injustice, and then a question about Israel and the nation of Israel, and should we see any dates in terms of what's happening there as indication of what's happening where we are tracking kind of the projected history of the world. Is that right? Are there any other questions, Duncan?
We might add in a couple as we go, but that'll be good to start with. So,
great. Which one should we do first?
I guess should we try and go at the racial time one, if that's okay, first of all?
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah.
It's
you
weird.
Tell us. Yeah.
Well, yeah, we started recording a series on, is this the end of the world, when we only had one seemingly quite unprecedented event, but now we've got 2 ongoing at the same time, which is interesting. And Revelation does have stuff to say about race relations, most notably when it talks about God's people being gathered in the new earth, and it describes a number beyond any which anyone can count, and it describes them being of every tribe and every tongue, which is interesting that people are still distinct in that sense. People are still from particular tribes and they still speak particular languages. And I think it's an interesting picture that God's offer of salvation is open to people regardless of their sort of ethnic or cultural background. He's bringing in his elect are going to be drawn from every single people group across the world. But it's also interesting that they remain themselves, they remain distinct, because God's idea of, I know, told me you were talking earlier today about fusion of cultures, but it's a fusion in which we don't lose our individual identity. It's a fusion in which we form individual parts that go out to make a greater whole. It's not like a homogenized monocultural thing where we've all been mashed together into one thing and we've all come out the same, if that makes sense. So we're supporting each other, we're learning from each other, but we remain ourselves.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. I think it's because we see, don't we? I was just trying to find the exact verse so I could read it out, and then I dropped my Bible, which was the banging noise. But it's fascinating, isn't it? So the every tribe and tongue come together, and there's a sense of unity, isn't there, around the throne. And I mean, we were talking about Romans in that, and the clear call there is not to live separate, but to come together. Don't see that addressed quite so much in Revelation, do we? Because it's not quite to the same topic. It's not answering the same question, but there's a clear picture of united, diverse people.
Definitely,
which is really interesting, and I think that it's also interesting reading Revelation, which was a book written by a guy who had been hugely oppressed by the Roman Empire. I mean, so John seemingly is in exile as a kind of somebody who's been arrested and sent away from his people on an island of Patmos. I mean, I think that's what the circumstances of the writing of the book are.
As I know, yeah.
And so, and he's not committed a crime. So he's somebody who's been unlawfully arrested, and he actually writes to a whole load of people to say to them, you're going to be really badly treated. And he pulls in, I think, the image from Daniel of how often when human kingdoms deny God and deny the God-given truths, and that could be a government, or it could be a company, or it even could be a collection of individuals who have no economic or structural power, but a group of people who, when they get together in a way that denies the truth of God, then Daniel says often they become kind of beast-like because Satan, the supernatural powers, push them in that direction, and that then causes them to mistreat ultimately other people on the earth. And I think certainly it's Revelation is a very interesting book to read with the mindset of, okay, so we're currently recognizing in our society structural racism, which seems to be the mistreatment of some people by certain things that have been established in companies and in society. It's an interesting book from that perspective, I think. Do you agree with that, Duncan?
Yeah, I do. I think it definitely, Revelation does talk a lot about God's people being oppressed by almost sort of agents of the powers and principalities in the world, and of the Roman Empire and other empires before and after that were serving as the agents of those kind of dark forces. I guess the only thing I would add to it is it's important to think of the individual people who are part of the Roman Empire not as being agents of oppression within themselves, that there was there are dark forces moving behind the scenes that's causing a lot of the oppression, but the individual people are best not to be sort of split into oppressor categories or anything like that, because some of the first converts to Jesus' ministry was like a Roman centurion and his family, weren't they? And it's unhelpful sometimes if we anything that tries to divide us on non-scriptural basis, I think, is unhelpful. Splitting down society or splitting down our identities is not always productive, if that makes sense. But at the same time, you don't want to be promoting a false unity and being like, oh, everyone's all united in Christ now, you don't need to worry about anything else. And I think getting that balance right between recognizing the importance of individual identities and the things that might be affecting particular types of people more than others, contrasting that with the importance of not demonizing either individuals or groups of individuals as being intrinsically kind of oppressors or oppressive people, but recognizing that most of this is the outworking of a spiritual reality, which is this visible reality is only a very small subset of the much wider reality. I say that quite a lot. I like that phrase.
Say that again, because why not? If you like it, let's say it again.
Yeah, that this physical reality that we can see is only a subset of a much wider reality. It wasn't me who invented that. I'm quoting someone, but it's important to remember, because it's very easy to look in a very materialistic way at problems which have their roots in kind of a more spiritual sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think it's, you saying that makes me think that the main narrative actually of the sort of the middle sections of Revelation, for sure, is it's focusing on that, isn't it? You know, the work of the enemy of God's people, and the Lamb or the angels or the representatives of God's people, and it's something that happens in a hidden dimension, the unseen realm, which then we catch up on, really, or kind of can perceive through what we see.
Yes, the solution to man's problems is fundamentally spiritual and not economic. Is something that is often important to remember, even in the face of instances where there are obvious actual economic problems as well. It doesn't mean don't fix those, but what's in the human heart is often the cause of problems rather than what's in your wallet or anything like that.
And the call, of course, to the kind of the key pastoral message of Revelation to the churches is, when this challenge comes to you, don't compromise, don't lose hope, but remain faithful, and God will ultimately be victorious.
It'd be very easy for the Christians in Rome, just after Revelation was written, to kind of have colluded with their oppressors in a sense and made their lives easier for them. But they were called to, stand up even when it was difficult, and stand against all those kind of forms of injustice.
Yeah. So fascinating stuff, isn't it? This book, it just never fails to amaze me that we come up against something that feels like, wow, this is something we really need to think about. And then you can really look at nearly every book of the Bible, and then it talks about it in a way that exposes some of God's truth. And as we put all the books together, we're like, right, okay.
It's a very multi-dimensional book, isn't it? That God manages to remain relevant in every culture and for every tribe and tongue, I guess, to link back to what we said earlier. So.
How nice. Okay. Have we done enough on that question, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Let's do the next one.
Yeah, go for it. Which one should we do next?
So we were going to do, should we do to return to COVID slightly? I think you'd probably be better off doing this. So this is a weighty one.
Yeah, you like to give me this one, don't you?
I do, yeah. So I did last time when we've got the recording went slightly wayward, but this feels like a church leader question. I don't know why, but.
So the question is COVID sent by God, like as a punishment, or is it from God? Should we see it as being God's agency that caused it to happen? I think that's kind of what we're discussing. And it would be really easy to jump to like a really neat, like, no, of course not. And I know lots of people will say that. But I think if we're going to really try and do justice to the book of Revelation, we want to acknowledge that in the book of Revelation, we do see, for example, in the book, we see that there are angels who are given by God bowls, which are of his wrath, and that they do bring about what's called plagues against the evil empire, which most people would see as being Rome, but could maybe represent anything which is inspired, used by the devil to work against God and his purposes. So we can't just instantly say no, but we do want to look at it and say, well, let's really think about this properly, because what it says in Revelation 17, verse 17, it says, God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose. He's talking about the beast and the 10 horns will attack the people of God. Put it in their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to give the beasts their power to rule until God's words are fulfilled. And so what we actually see is probably what's the main story here is sort of a parallel back to what happened in Exodus, where actually God allows a force opposed to him to perform an act against him, which he ultimately will use for his purposes. So I want to talk about Kung Fu Panda 2, which is one of my favorite movies. And at the end of Kung Fu Panda 2, there's a giant cannon which the evil peacock has constructed in order to destroy Kung Fu Panda and all the kind of the allies, the good people. So the work of evil has created this huge cannon. And the way it works at the end is that there's no hope, seemingly, because the power of the cannon is so great. And yet what Kung Fu Panda does is he causes the peacock to fire the cannon at Kung Fu Panda. And as he fires it at Kung Fu Panda, he catches the cannonball and spins it back and throws it back at the peacock, which blows up the cannon and destroys the cannon. So the question is, did Kung Fu Panda want the cannon to be fired? And the answer is, well, he kind of didn't want it to be fired because he wants to destroy it. But he did want it to be fired because he allowed the firing of it to actually contribute in the end to the destruction of the cannon. And ultimately, I think we see Satan being given some power by God. Gordon Fee talks about he's a tethered foe. So he's restrained. He can't go do anything he wants, but he has given some space to act, because ultimately the actions that Satan can achieve will be used by God, thrown back at him to destroy Satan and win the victory. And the cross is the absolute pinnacle of this activity, isn't it? So the cross is the crucifixion of God. So it's like the greatest attack against God that the devil can achieve. And yet God purposed for it to happen, because in it he can send the cannonball back at the devil and defeat him. So that's the overarching thing. We then have to put COVID into that and think, hold on a minute, like, how do we understand COVID? Now, Revelation doesn't talk about COVID, doesn't mention it specifically. And so there's all kinds of illnesses which are purely used by the enemy to steal, kill, and destroy. But we also know that God can, in that work, turn it back against the enemy and use it for the good of those who love him. And Romans chapter 8, verse 38, Joseph in the book of Genesis will tell me what he meant for evil, God meant for good, or God turns to good. So I refuse to give like the really neat answer of, oh no, it's definitely not from God, because God allows things to happen at the instigation of the enemy, which ultimately will bring to our good, and maybe bring us more good than if they didn't happen. Now, that's the theological answer. If you are somebody who's suffering at the moment from COVID, you've lost a loved one, or you just kind of, again, like, so the black and minority ethnic communities have suffered way more even in this, in COVID, than those from white skin color and ethnicity. If you're the message of Revelation to you on something like COVID is, well, God himself will act as your defender, and he will ultimately bring good to you if you trust in him. So you don't need to worry about that kind of whole precursor bit of, this is the working behind the scene. You just know, my God is for me, he's my protector, he'll work me good. Does that make sense, Duncan? Does that come through?
I think that makes sense.
I think we can't be oversimplistic when we talk about evil and things that are evil in the earth. I think the Bible refuses to be oversimplistic. It's simpler obviously to be oversimplistic, but I think the Bible is not that kind of book, is it?
No, it's not. And I sometimes wish it was. I'd love to have more kind of this is exactly how everything works in there, and it doesn't tend to do that. It tends to talk in terms of character and narrative rather than sort of technical schematics of the universe and exactly what how God's sovereignty and man's responsibility both kind of coexist at the same time. And it doesn't. It tells us that God is in control, and it also tells us that man has free will and is able to make decisions. And both of those things are true. And it's a tension that's outworked in how we, in our lives and in our faith. It's not like an answer that you can write down, if that makes sense. You know,
absolutely.
I wish it was, really. I love understanding stuff, and it annoys me when some stuff is left deliberately beyond human understanding.
Yeah, I mean, the end of Revelation, right, is just sort of sums up the kind of the thing in it, because it's like, he who testifies these things says, yes, I am coming soon. And you're like, the grace of Lord Jesus be with God's people. So you've got this simultaneous, like, please God come, because we trust you. You're good, and you are going to sort everything out. But in the meantime, we need some grace, because it's not simple. And, you know, my grandmother or whoever it is died of this horrible thing, and I couldn't even go to the funeral, and that's awful. You know, we need grace in this time. And yet the grace enables us to continue to trust God, see him as good, see him as loving, to be able to be sustained in the midst of the work of evil, which is clear and present and experienced in extremely deep and horrible ways.
Makes sense, yeah.
So go on then, you can answer the question about should we see, or can we see in the book of Revelation marker points that the history of the nation of Israel shows us where we're at in the narrative? And is there any hope? You know, what's the go on?
So I think you and I disagree slightly on this, and I think a lot of where people tend to fall on this issue depends on what emphasis you're putting on the Revelation is for first century church in around, you know, the Roman Empire, and for our lives now, versus, well, it is for that, but it's also describing the very, very end of the age as well. And you know, very few people would say, oh, it's just for the early church and maybe a bit now. And hopefully not too many people would say, oh, it's only about stuff that's going to happen in the last bit before the end of the age. As long as you're somewhere in the middle, that's probably okay. And one of the parameters often of exactly where you fall on that is how much you see the sort of the last 100 years or so of Jewish ethnic history as being relevant for the end times or not. And I see quite a lot of stuff happening in Revelation as a future fulfillment or a further fulfillment of things that have happened once already. And so I see a relatively significant role for the ethnic nation of Israel. For me, the fact that the land was originally promised to God's chosen people many thousand years ago, and the fact that they still exist as a distinct and separate ethnic group is incredible. You know, if you look back at other tribes that are around 2,000 years ago, you can't find someone who's a Hittite. You won't even find an Angle or a Pict or something like that. You know, these tribes don't exist anymore. They've all been amalgamated and reconfigured. And yet God's chosen people have remained distinct and they have their own identity still. And the fact that they were then returned to their land 2,000 years after being banished in the first mountain peak, which we were talking about, where Jesus is on the Mount of Olives and telling them that when that's going to happen. That, to me, is a remarkable sign of God's working through history and, you know, his commitment to his covenant people. So I do think that if you read a lot of Revelation, it talks about physical places in Israel. You know, Armageddon happens at the town of Megiddo, which is a literal town which you can go and visit now if you want to. And so I do see a fairly literal fulfillment of a lot of it, and for that requires God's chosen people to be in situ in the promised land. And for me, then I would see that as a key building block in preparing the world for the end of the age. But that doesn't mean, you know, some people, particularly when the Jews retook Jerusalem in 1967, 67, I'm going to go with, people saw that as being, oh, well, you know, this could be a very imminent end of the world, which so far hasn't happened. And I think people sometimes can get a bit like everything that happens to Israel has eschatological significance. So I know a lot of our American Christian friends got really excited about the American embassy being moved to Israel from Tel Aviv. That's nothing. That really has nothing to do with the end of the world at all. That's just a political decision that happened, you know. And I think it's important not to get over focused on Israel's role in the end times. God's relationship at the moment is with His church, which was always His plan all along. You know, the nation of Israel was always supposed to be out to bless the Gentiles and to bring blessings to all of the people of the earth from every tribe and tongue, which we're going to keep repeating today.
Yeah.
And that is God's primary focus now and during the eventual end of the age will be Christians. But I think that there will still be a significant and interesting role for Israel, but it's important not to overplay it. You, Tom, I think slightly differently.
I mean, maybe I mean it's a conversation I'm still having and interested in having. I think that there's like a parameter that I'm like, oh yeah, I get that. I totally feel like you and I are reading the same Bible and we're in the same place. And then there's places where I feel like, oh, hold on a minute, like have you read Galatians? Like have you read Romans without just purely trying to say this is what it must mean, like to try and read the book of Romans all the way through? And have you read Revelation all the way through with a desire to actually understand what's the book saying as a book, rather than just, oh, here's a verse that feels like it fits with what I want it to say?
Very easy to do that.
I mean, that's the whole thing we're trying to do on this book, isn't it? With this videos, is to try and help us not do that. We want to take these books as being written as entire books, as part of a huge canon, inspired by the Holy Spirit, and to embrace the whole counsel of God and not just pick a little text here and there. I think where I felt most uncomfortable when it comes to the topic of what happens to ethnic Israel, and you know, I'm not an expert on this, but where I felt most uncomfortable, where I feel it is most out of tune with the New Testament narrative, is not to do with, you know, the land or whatever it is. It's where it feels that there's a separate hope for these people which is outside of the Church of Jesus Christ. And I don't think if we put it like that, people would say that, but sometimes when people talk about it, it kind of belies that they somehow think there's a separate thing for ethnic Israel from what there is for the Church of Jesus Christ. And I personally think just the huge effort of Paul especially, but all the New Testament apostles, was to say the only hope we have is in Jesus Christ. He is the only King, and He has one people, one Lord, one church, one faith. And so where the Lord chooses to return, if He'll choose, you know, if He'll return and rule from the Mountain of Olives, and there's many ethnic Jews who are streaming in at that time. I mean, brilliant! Isn't that amazing? I've huge sympathy with that as a idea. And so if people are like, oh, we need to support the nation of Israel against Palestine, the nation of Palestine for these following, and that's, oh, I just get a little bit nervous about that as an outworking of it feels like it's a slightly different theology from what I see in the New Testament.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Makes sense. I think we've landed a lot closer to each other than when we first spoke about this like a month or so ago, which is strange.
Yeah, I don't think we disagree about. I mean, we have so much. All of us, right, on these topics. Sometimes these topics can be used as the wedge, can't they? Like, oh, which side of the correct line are you on? And that's just, as you said, divisiveness is not what we want to be
bad, isn't it?
No. it's not a good thing. So that's it. So do you want to? I think that's enough. we're going to go on too long if we keep on going, although we could.
Yeah,
But do
true.
you want to give us a summary, kind of conclusion? Or did you have any other questions you thought, oh no, people would definitely be wanting to ask
I
this?
don't think so particularly, no. So
round it up for us then, Duncan.
all right, let's bring it home. So I guess there's a few things, if we look at this whole series of 3 videos we've done, there's a few things that I'd want people to draw from it, really. We've looked at a huge number of topics. We've looked at the pandemic, we've looked at racial injustice, we've looked at what's happening with Israel, but I guess mainly we've been looking at what Revelation means for us. And when I first talked about in the first session about ways of understanding biblical prophecy, it was to hopefully open your eyes to see that Revelation isn't just something that's going to happen in the future, this sort of story of the last few years of the world, but to recognize that we're in the end times right now. And Revelation is a book not just about the future, but one that speaks to us today. And so our focus hasn't been about the future end of the world or the current pandemic, but about the narrative of Revelation and how it relates to us. A story of tough times, of persecution, of injustice, and of deception, and all these things working together to undermine our faith in Christ. But also a story of us standing firm and overcoming the Rome or the Babylon world system, and together, all of us entering the New Jerusalem. It's a story of hope for the afflicted, that not only will God intervene in world history to right every wrong, He's guiding us through some of the wrongness now. He's guiding us through a story that's going to come to an incredible conclusion. Now, that ending is going to feature a time of tribulation, and you and I may disagree about exactly what that looks like, how much of it's going to be future fulfillment, exactly what Revelation is telling us about what's going to happen. But I think all of us are going to agree on what happens when we come out the other side. We can all agree on what's going to await us. If I can read a little bit from Revelation 21. So I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. There was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among his people. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." I remember reading this before when I did the sermon a good few months ago before the pandemic started, and I think I'd be quite happy reading it out to you guys every time I'm talking in front of the congregation. I love this passage so much, and it speaks to me that whether we're facing, a deadly pandemic, or whether we're facing, centuries of injustice and discrimination, or whether we're facing a personal, health problems or relationship breakdowns or whatever it is that's affecting us at the moment, a time is coming when this narrative will be brought to a conclusion, where we get to the happy ending, the final chapter, where there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain. And I think that's incredibly inspiring. That is a hope which should be able to give us so much strength and kind of ability, resilience to cope with all the difficulties that we may have to face. And that's the main thing I guess I wanted to draw from Revelation. Things are working together for our good, even though it will not seem like it at the moment. So we need to be alert, we need to be watchful for what's going on in the world, but we need to be inspired fundamentally by how beautifully the story ends. Don't look at all the badness and all the tribulation and all the unfairness and all the awfulness, but to be inspired by the beauty of God and the joy that's going to await us in the heavenly Jerusalem. Cool. I guess that's my ending. So,
Well, that's not a bad way to end.
Not a bad ending, is it? That's a nice way to end the series. Yeah.
So, thank you so much for tuning in and watching this far. If you've enjoyed it, let us know, and we can try and do another one on another book or another topic.
Yeah.
If you've got any suggestions for things you'd like us to discuss, just let us know. We love this stuff. I would happily talk for hours and hours and hours about these things with Duncan, and I'm pretty sure you would do the same.
Definitely. Yeah, I'd be very up for that.
So let us know. We're so grateful for you guys being part of this conversation. and let's see this as an invitation from the Lord to kind of keep pushing into rethinking through what does it mean to be people of Jesus living in the world at the moment. So,
Amen.